Hello, welcome to Lecture 2 of Computational Neuroscience. This is Systems 552, Biology 487, University of Waterloo, being taught in the winter term of 2021. And today we're going to cover the central nervous system. So, in the last lecture we talked sort of, so again, going back to the scale, this sort of slide that's showing the various different scales we're talking about throughout this course. In the last slide, we talked about neurons and the details inside neurons. Now, in this lecture, we're going to scale up and talk about groups of neurons, the whole central nervous system, and how it's sort of divided into components. The readings for this is chapter 15 and 18 of Candela et al. Just looking at these functions of the major systems and the information flow between them. Definitely want to highlight, we are not expecting in this course that you remember everything that I'm being said here. There's tons and tons and tons of detail about the high-level structures, and there's whole fields, and people can spend their whole lives studying all of this stuff. I don't need you to know everything about this, but I do want to know functions and names of at least the basic systems. There is a spinal cord. What does it do? There's a brainstem. There's some older subcortical structures, and then there's the cortex, and it's got some major divisions in it. That sort of really high-level structure, I think, is useful, and some sense of how information flows throughout the brain. It's very, very, very easy to get lost in the details, though. So I'm just going to put that out there in the warning. And the details definitely do matter, and the details are definitely interesting. But for the purpose of this course, I just want to make sure you've had a vague flavor of the whole thing. How are we going to approach looking at the whole brain? The order I'm going to present things in is basically to go through in order of evolution. So sort of the idea here is, let's start with things that are present in really evolutionary, very, very simple, were evolved very early on, and then add on top of that sort of structures that showed up later in evolutionary history, and hopefully that will sort of give a sense of things building on top of other things. Of course, this is going to be more of just a guide, not an actual fact. Certainly, as higher level structures evolved and came along later on, that certainly also meant that those lower level structures themselves also changed. So it's not like these components evolved once and then are fixed, and then the new component is evolved and add on top of it. But we're at least going to use this as sort of a general organizational structure. I'm also going to warn people that there's exceptions to almost every rule about the brain, and it's really hard to make these sorts of overall statements. So for instance, at some point I'm going to be saying that, oh, hey, look, all the information coming into the brain gets routed through the thalamus. And then there's an exception that we're like, oh, it turns out that the sense of smell does not get routed through the thalamus, and it's just really annoying, and we just have to deal with that, that there's just exceptions all over the place. But we're often going to end up saying something like, okay, this particular brain area X does Y, this particular brain area has this particular function, and it's probably going to be the case that, okay, lots of other things are also involved in that function, and there's probably lots of other things that brain area does, but that's still a useful organizational structure. Every part of the brain does a lot of different things. They also rely on lots of other parts of the brain in order to do their job. But we still can find some sorts of statements about some sort of functional organization in these systems. At least that's going to be the overall attempt. Okay, how can we go ahead and do this? Let's start with a really, really simple nervous system. This is the sort of a really simple little nematode worm. It is C. elegans, one of the simplest little animals. And it's got a really nice, it's got a pretty simple nervous system. We've got peripheral nerves that run along it. We've got sort of things here on the side that are doing some sort of sensing of information. this little group around here has some sort of nice sort of coordinating some motor behaviors. These commands come out, and there's this little interesting little branching that lets it that sort of is letting it control different aspects of the output. This sort of, hey, I've got some sensing stuff, I've got some sort of centralized, hey, information being grouped together, and then I've got information being sent back out and sending back out to motors, is kind of a general organizational thing that you'll find in brains. And indeed, that's one way of summarizing what brains do. The basic function of a brain is there's some sort of sensory information coming in, figure out what to do with it, and send those commands back out to muscles normally. So that structure is there right early on. And indeed, that basic diagram fits pretty well with the spinal cord in mammals. We're getting a lot of information from the sensory neurons of most of the body, not the ones from the head, but from the rest of the body, are coming into this central spinal column that's, again, going down your spine. And then there's these long axons that are projecting sensory information up to the brain. Brain figures out what to do with that information. And then there's these long axons that send information back down. Oh, sorry, over on this side, long axons that send information back down. And then depending on where they're going to, that axon sort of comes out and goes and starts connecting to the muscles in the right location. Okay. And this is why, of course, if there's damage to the spine, it's a big problem. It's sort of like, okay, well, if I'm damaging the spine and we're cutting some of these, either the sensory system or the motor system, going up and down, then that's why we get things like paralysis or disruption to different sensory systems. Okay, fine. That sort of idea seems all right. Does the spinal cord says, okay, the information comes into the spinal cord, goes all the way up to the brain, figure out what to do with it, come back down. It's not necessarily entirely perfectly true. There are some things the spinal cord can do totally on its own. So the classic example of this is the knee-jerk reflex. That's the one where you're, the doctor takes the little rubber hammer and hits just below your knee, and your leg kicks forward. What the heck's happening there is the hammer is sort of, when it hits there, you're stretching some muscles. That's causing some activation in a sensory neuron, and that sensory neuron is directly connecting to motor neurons that are going to go ahead and add tension to this muscle, and so your knee pulls forward. And that signal just happens really quickly right there. And the signal does not end up going all the way up to your brain. Why? Why this interesting exception? This is there's sort of two reasons. One is that, look, this is a really simple set of processing. I suppose one core question is why do we have this reflex? The reason you have this reflex is when you are standing, and if you start leaning back a little bit, just for sort of very subtly, that is normally something that would cause a little bit of stretch to this muscle, and so you're sort of getting an immediate response to add tension to this muscle a little bit in order to pull yourself up. So this is a balance system. This is trying to just automatically keep you upright, and you want that control loop really fast. You don't want to wait for that signal to go all the way up to the brain and come back. And it's a really simple sort of calculation to do. You don't need the full access to the entire brain in order to compute that sort of really simple if-then rule. So if you can get away with just computing it right there in the spinal cord, sure. And of course, there's the possibility that the brain could do signals to sort of suppress this reflex or things like that. But the upper brain could perhaps override a system like this, but this is sort of a really simple example of here is some really low-lying underlying system, and then higher level brain areas could override or make use of that or build upon that. All right, but core idea is, look, if I don't need the whole brain, I don't need the whole brain. I'll just compute it here, and it's going to be much faster if I don't have to send that message all the way up and back. But if you want to do more complicated sort of actions, it's pretty hard to do that right locally on a muscle. You could maybe get away with something like the slithering of a snake. You can sort of get away with sort of a really simple behavior there that could be right within something like the spinal cord. But for something like running, you really want to have some sort of higher level control that's coordinating all of the motor activity. And so if I want to have a system that's coordinating all that motor activity, I'm going to put it somewhere. Let's put it on the top of the spinal cord. I'm getting all the inputs from all the different senses and body parts. I can coordinate a response, and then I can send a signal back to the whole rest of the system. And that's going to be sort of the beginnings of how the brain is going to build up. The sort of terminology we generally call the central nervous system just everything above the spinal cord. There's going to be it's going to be a very fuzzy line between what's taken care of in the spinal cord and what's taken care of at higher levels. So it's often all part of the whole system. And certainly, as we're going to get more higher level control, we're going to be using that higher level control to modify, what the spinal cord and the motors below and the muscles and things, what they're doing. That's going to cause some change in the world. That's going to cause some sort of sensory feedback, and then that's going to either be doing these sorts of immediate low-level feedback loops, like the knee-jerk reflex, or that information goes all the way up to the higher level of the brain, and then we go and modulate things down. Okay, that's going to be the sort of idea. So what's at the top of the brain? What's at the top of the spinal cord? So we're going to call this the brainstem. It's sort of the oldest part of the central nervous system, and really it's started by doing, sort of evolutionarily. Initially, it would have been the only thing that was there, sort of in the nematode C. elegans. That was the only thing that was there, and so it had to control everything. Now, in humans anyway, and in any sort of complex mammals, really it's just going to be a sort of a hub of routing information. It's just going to take all of that information. It's going to at least get the sensory information from the rest of the head and face, feed that all in, and then pass that back up to the upper brain. But what's it actually going to be doing is going to be the sort of things that don't really require highly complex control. So, heart rate, something has to control that. Keeping your balance, blood pressure, shutting down things so that you can sleep, breathing. These sorts of really, really low-level things that, you can sometimes override some of those things. You can control your breathing if you really want to, but most of the time you don't really have any conscious control over most of those things. And so, it's just going to have some nice low-level control. Again, it probably eventually did a whole bunch of other things, including muscle control. Nowadays, it's basically just anything that's also involving external muscles. So fine, it's still controlling your heart muscles, but any sort of external muscles, that's more just going to sort of pass that information again on to the higher brain functions. Okay. All right. So what are those sort of next things going to be doing? Sorry. So as I was saying there, so one thing is brainstem. One thing it's doing is just routing information to higher areas. Another thing it's doing is dealing with these sorts of regular rhythms that you don't really need to control much. heart rate, blood pressure, and whatnot. It's also going to do a little bit of really coarse-grained regulation. So things like how alert you are, sort of just being able to do a really sort of high-level changes in or really coarse-grained changes in body state. So, am I asleep or am I awake? Things like that. And those sorts of signals are going to change how we're going to pass information to the rest of the brain. All right, hopefully that's vaguely. So that's the brainstem. So again, you've got this brain down here, or the spinal cord coming up to the brainstem. Before we go on to the rest of the sort of the core brain, we're going to stop first at this cerebellum thing. Mostly because it's a little bit weird. Well, every part of the brain is a little bit weird. What the heck is this little thing at the back? Well, it's actually where most of the neurons are. So it's something like 80% of the neurons in the brain are in this little lump at the back. It's about 10% of the volume, 80% of the neurons. Those pictures that I showed last class where there was like these neurons with like ridiculously weird structures, yeah, those are all in the cerebellum. And interestingly, it's that whole cerebellum, even though it has tons and tons and tons of neurons, it doesn't, like, the structure is sort of like the same structure repeated over and over and over again. There isn't much variety in there. And it's getting data from pretty much the whole rest of the brain, but then outputs mostly to the brainstem. And then the brainstem combines that information with what it's getting from the rest of the brain and sends it off to the rest of the body. And the idea is that it seems to be doing something about fine-tuning, well, motor commands is what people usually initially believed that it was sort of only really relevant for motor commands. And what sort of fine-tuning? It's sort of like learning to do actions more smoothly, or learning the particular timing of actions. One classic study is the eye blink conditioning, where you ring a bell and then puff air into the eye of some poor unsuspecting creature, and you do that a few times, and with a precise timing between when you ring the bell and when you puff the air, and after a little bit, that will just learn to, the ring of the bell, and then you start blinking, you start closing your eye in preparation for the puff of air. And this can happen just totally automatically. And that is directly controlled by the cerebellum. So that sort of precise, fine timing of information seems to be really relevant there. As I said, it was initially thought of as just sort of this short-term adaptation motor learning sort of thing. It's become more and more evidence in recent years that, it's also being involved in this same sort of pattern matching, but of higher level things. So even things like if I'm saying a sequence of words that I say often, or thinking a sequence of thoughts that I think often, it could be very much involved in figuring out what in helping with that timing, or helping figure out the dynamics of what you're observing or what you're thinking in sort of internal information as opposed to just external information. Yes, so something about short-term adaptation and on the order of half second to a second at most, and timing of information, and associating, first I get this stimulus, then I get this stimulus, then I get this stimulus, and sort of doing this sort of near-term prediction seems to be a big part of what it's doing, and then using that prediction to sort of smooth motor actions, and other sorts of actions, cognitive actions as well. All right. Maybe, all right, so something about that sort of pattern matching seems to be going on in the cerebellum, seems to be really important. So at least it's got a lot of neurons devoted to it, but perhaps not much area. What else is going on up there? So we've got brainstem and cerebellum. Now we're going to go into what are generally called the subcortical areas. So this is basal ganglia, thalamus, hippocampus, hypothalamus, and amygdala. a bunch of things, and again, they're evolutionarily pretty old. You're going to find them in all mammals, and indeed precursors to a lot of them in lots of other creatures as well. But they're all underneath the cortex, this sort of outer thing. So that's why we're going to call them subcortical areas. So structurally what's going to happen is all of them are going to be connected down to the brainstem, and then they're also going to be connected up to the cortex. And these various different components we're going to talk about, they all tend to have very different structure and are really anatomically distinct. And indeed, each of them even often have internal structure of different, it's all still made of neurons, but organized in very different ways in various different parts of these components. And so the idea is going to be, look, these are going to be involved in doing things that are a little bit higher order than what the brainstem was doing. It's not just breathing. It's not just heartbeat. We're going to do things a little bit more complex, but still not quite as complex as what you're going to see as we get into the high-level cortex stuff. So, as an example, something like fear response. So this is something that it's not going to be a hardwired, oh, if I get this sensory stimuli, I should express fear or respond in a certain way. Exactly what stimuli one is, that causes fear, and exactly how you express the fear, those themselves need to be learned based on previous experience. And so you need some sort of higher level, something a little bit more complicated than just, okay, here's the sensory data coming in, and I need to do some sort of pattern matching on that sensory data. I need some sort of associations going on in there. So we're going to need things to be a little bit more complex. All of these systems are going to sort of engage pretty quickly, but then you can override, or sometimes you can override such systems from the higher level cerebral cortex stuff. Certainly want to say, so the argument is going to be that in simpler creatures, simpler mammals anyway, that don't have particularly developed cerebral cortexes, these subcortical regions are sufficient to do a lot of behaviors. You don't like, so sort of animal level behaviors should be sufficiently done by these systems. But in humans, a lot of the more complex control stuff has perhaps moved out of some of these areas and moved to the cortex, because humans have a much more developed cortex than other mammals. All right, so what are these sorts of areas? Let's start with the thalamus. It's generally thought of as a routing system, as a look, this is how data gets everywhere in the cortex. So if I need to control data, the flow of data throughout the brain, it's going to be going through the thalamus. All the sensory data feeds into the thalamus, and then the thalamus can go connect out to lots of different areas. Of course, as I mentioned before, there's exceptions to every rule. Turns out that the sense of smell does not go through the thalamus. Anyway, exceptions. Fine. We're going to be, so this is going to be responsible for gating the flow of information. The idea is going to be that we can do, it gives us the opportunity to have sort of, in different situations, I want to route information from different parts of the brain. So I might be, have one part of the brain that's thinking of a word, and if I want to actually say the word, then I need to route that information from that part of the brain to the motor part of the brain, so it actually go ahead and say something. So I need both the thalamus, something to do that, to actually implement that routing, and of course I'm going to also need something to control the thalamus to control when I'm going to do that routing. We'll get to that later. That'll be the basal ganglia. One sort of very classic thing that thalamus will do sort of interesting routing for is dealing with sort of shutting down sensory information when you're sleeping, things like that. So that can be a nice sort of really large-scale shutdown of information in the thalamus, yeah, certainly we're also going to need to do more fine-grained control as well. Anyway, central routing system brings in lots of information, sends it to lots of different places. Onto the amygdala. This is going to be sort of closely tied to, I guess, what we're going to call emotional processing. Again, we're getting inputs from lots and lots of different sensory areas. And sort of the idea there is that we're getting information about some sort of high-level representations of aspects of the external world. So what objects are you seeing? What faces are you hearing? Are you seeing? What sounds are you hearing? And it's also getting inputs from areas we'll talk about that do things like memory. And so that's going to give some sort of context information about the environment. And then the idea is the amygdala is going to be learning to make associations between these things. So the classic example here is, for instance, fear. So if you, here's the standard rat experiment where you play a sound and then shock the rat. And it will eventually, when the sound plays, the rat will just immediately go into freeze mode and just, and that's exactly what the amygdala is going to be doing. It's going to be learning, okay, am I in the situation where a particular sorts of responses, particular sorts of emotional response makes sense? And if I am, then go and initiate that response. And so that sort of signals are going to go out to, so the outputs from this area are going to do things like control the heart rate, respiration, sweating, the adrenaline levels, things like that's going to outputs, what should my adjust my adrenaline levels. It's also going to take that output and send the output to the cortex so that the rest of the brain knows what sort of emotional state I'm in, so I can go ahead and use that information elsewhere. So yeah, that sort of pattern matching of given my situation, what sort of emotional state seems to be done by the amygdala. That aspect of adrenaline, that output saying, hey, look, okay, I should go ahead and adjust adrenaline levels, heart rate, things like that. That's actually passed along. That information is actually the actual control of those hormone levels is run by another of these structures, the hypothalamus. It's just sort of adjusting this sort of control of things like hunger and thirst and attention and arousal. So these are things that they're sort of really low-level things. They're not quite as low-level as what the brainstem is doing, or at least the brainstem, say breathing, it's just more sort of, okay, maintain this particular rhythm. Whereas the hypothalamus is more like, oh, no, I'm in this particular emotional state. I need this particular adrenaline sort of state. I need access to more oxygen, so let's start breathing faster. So what I was trying to say there is that it's sort of context-dependent signals. It's not just fine. I need to keep the heart rate going pretty much always. Let's adjust this based on context. Most of these are hormones that are going to the rest of the body. Of course, these hormones also then turn around and affect the brain. So it is also the case that these hormones are not just affecting the rest of the body, it's also affecting the brain. So in a certain way, the hypothalamus is outputting to the rest of the brain, but in a very weird way. So not in the standard way that neurons communicate of having neural connections and spikes, but more in terms of, okay, let's adjust the overall background neurotransmitter levels, or generally making neurons more sensitive to firing or things like that. Again, that's sort of exactly the influence of those various different hormones on the brain itself is poorly understood, or at least maybe you can understood it's sort of okay how it can affect one neuron, but personally how it affects large groups of neurons is still an open question. What else have we got in our whirlwind list of brain areas? Hippocampus. This is the classic thing for forming memories. Again, all the information from the rest of the brain is being all sort of fed into this one area. And the idea here is that it's doing something to let us combine the state of the whole brain into sort of a memory of the current moment and encode those memories somehow. And it turns out that information, the actual encoding of the memory turns out to not be in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is definitely required for forming the memory, but once the memory is formed, it seems like you can access it without the hippocampus. So this is the classic example of anterograde amnesia. So this is the amnesia where people are perfectly good remembering their whole past and what they did in the past, but just can't form new memories. So movies like Memento, and that's exactly this sort of damage to this particular subcortical structure. So encode something about taking all this current information, encoding it, and it seems to be also heavily involved, like there's a strong connections with the amygdala so that it can do, so that the emotional salience of memories seems to be very involved. And there also is a heavy emphasis in terms of representing space. And so there's a whole bunch of structures in the hippocampus that are very carefully encoding your position in space, and neurons that change in a very regular way as you move around positions in space. And so that seems to might be very important for what's the spatial relationship between memories, how do you move, as you're moving through events, or moving through sequences of things you've been in the past in order to form a memory. So a lot of stuff about spatial planning is going to seems to be involved here. Yeah, there we are. That seems fair. So memories. Next, basal ganglia. This is going to be, I think the easiest way to do this one is something like an executive command system. What do we mean by that? There's lots and lots of different things you could do at any given moment. Which one do you want to choose to do right now? And what it's going to do is, again, it's getting information from all of cortex, pretty much the whole rest of the brain. That information is going to come into the system, and then the main output is going to be to the thalamus. And so the idea is that it's, given my current situation, how should I be routing information within my brain? And so there's a standard story with, so again, in this diagram over here, these boxes here, that's the boxes that are part of the basal ganglia. Cortex and the rest of the brain are feeding into it. It's doing some sort of matching. The general argument is something like, for each action I know how to do, should I do it is in one path, and should I not do it is in another path. And then the combination of both of those gets turned into all right, what actions should I do? The different actions are going to change the routing in the thalamus, and that's going to then affect information in the cortex, and the cycle is going to repeat. That's sort of the standard story. There's also a nice learning mechanism that seems to be built in here that seems to be based on reward. That'll let you sort of change what actions you're doing in different times. That's the sort of the standard story. The more nuanced, more common story now. So that was sort of the old diagram of how the basal ganglia worked. When you actually want to put in all of the different connections that the basal ganglia actually has, you get this other diagram. So things are a little bit more complicated than what I just described there, but that basic story, all of these brain areas are more complicated than what I just described, but that basic story is a pretty common one for the basal ganglia. I definitely want to highlight that, so it's generally thought of as choosing actions, but I definitely want to highlight that these can be cognitive actions as well. So for instance, if you are counting and you're currently at number 3, this might be the thing that says, oh, okay, I should, the action that I'm going to do now is I was at 3, I'm going to go to 4 as my next number. That might be something that would be kind controlled by this sort of internal action. That might be controlled by the basal ganglia. Certainly damage to the basal ganglia in diseases like Parkinson's disease seems to really make it difficult to voluntarily control actions. So one of the standard tests for Parkinson's disease is you tell people, hey, here's a sequence of nonsense syllables, just repeat them over and over again. And one of the diagnostic markers for Parkinson's is people have difficulty with that task. So that sort of voluntary control, even though they in other situations they'd be perfectly fine. Like if that sequence of syllables was something they had to do in order to say a word that they say constantly, or that they have said before, then they could still say that same sequences of syllables, but not under specific voluntary control like that. The other classic example with Parkinson's is you can have people that are, they can't walk at all. Like the ability of like lifting one leg and stepping and stepping and stepping is extremely difficult. You put them on a bicycle and they're fine, because there's so much other sorts of structures that end up happening in order to ride a bicycle, and it seems to be very different parts of the brain. Whereas the voluntary movements involved in walking seem to be extremely damaged by the system. And again, it's most obvious in these things when these are motor actions, but the same thing is going to happen with internal cognitive actions. All right, that was a ridiculously high-level overview of a bunch of different subcortical brain areas. The actual details of all that stuff and what's connected, the actual details of all that stuff is probably not needed for this course. But as a sort of a high-level sort of thing, what have we got here? We've got a system for coordinating context-sensitive bodily behavior. That was the hypothalamus. We've got something that'll assign salience, we're particularly taking emotional salience, to sensory representations. Oh, this is an important thing. Be scared of it. This is an important thing. Really like it. That's the amygdala. We've got something that can consolidate and form long-term memories, hippocampus. We've got something to learn goal-directed behavior. We're sort of, okay, here's a sequence of actions that lets me get to a goal. There's a basal ganglia. And we've got systems for just routing information around that'll let us control what the heck's going on in the brain at different points in time. Those all seem like useful components. Seems like we probably need more than that to get like at least a human brain. And the idea is going to be that this is what's going to take us to the cortex. So this is sort of the outer layer of the brain. Evolutionarily, it's the newest one. It's the one that's most developed in humans and is sort of what distinguishes our brains from other creatures. All of the subcortical areas that I've been talking about so far, really they were sort of identified anatomically. Like it's just sort of, okay, you cut open a brain, you start looking at it, and you see these various different structures. Right, and so the actual identification of those structures was done really early on. It's part of why all of their names are useless. All their names are just sort of amygdala. Okay, that means it's kind of almond shaped. Hypothalamus. It's below the thalamus. that's all it means. So like the names don't have anything to do with the function. Is just because they were named so early on. In the cortex, since it's sort of initially kind of, if you just cut open the brain, it just all looks like one big giant thing. Again, let me just go back there. So it just looks like this, and you're like, I don't know, how do I want to subdivide that? It just looks like one big thing. And the first steps on it, the first steps towards sort of breaking down the cortex into different sub areas. It started being very anatomical. Started just being, all right, let's just look at it really closely and kind of see can I see slight subtle differences in the neural structure or connectivity between these different areas? So these are the first person, or the what that's generally called is Brodmann's areas, after one of the people who initially did that work, and sort of cut it all up into parts. But again, this was just all anatomical. It's just sort of, well, there seems to be a slight difference between the neurons here and the neurons here. So I'm going to call this area 7 and call this area 19. And was very specific, like, look, let's just give these things numbers because we have no idea what they do functionally. But what we really want from this sort of cortex is it'd be nice to have something like a functional description, like what we've eventually got for things like the hippocampus and cerebellum and whatnot. And the sort of functions that we're going to end up sort of applying to the rest of this whole cortex is things like sensory processing, motor planning, working declarative memory, planning, imagination, reasoning, language, social cognition, all these sorts of things that we're going to want to sort of, how are those done? Are there particular brain areas dedicated to each of these things? All of these things, there definitely isn't going to be sort of, okay, here is a brain area that does social cognition. That's not how it's going to break down. But definitely it's going to be coordination between these sorts of regions and some sort of localization, some sort of specialization for particular areas, but it's going to be a lot of coordination between areas for any sort of complex process. And the big challenge of this sort of anatomical functional mapping is trying to figure out, okay, can we come up with some sort of way of describing one particular brain region that'll let us make sense of that big mess. Okay. So, what's the progress in that direction? First of all, there's very few clear anatomical divisions that'll help us divide the function. Like there is this sort of nice line here, the sort of the lateral sulcus. Sorry, the sulcus is just a term for the big giant fold here. And there's this one big lateral one that's pretty much always there, and then there's a central one that's pretty much always there. And that's at least, those lines are at least going to divide us into sort of frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and then we're vaguely going to have at the back the occipital lobe, and we'll talk about this later. So there's a little bit of that separation there, but one major feature about the cortex is there's tons and tons and tons and tons of connections back and forth across all of this. So because there's so much connections back and forth, there isn't going to be much localization of function that way. So the neurons are talking to across each other, so that's going to be a little bit harder to track down exactly what the functions are. But we're still going to have some localization. So, and the way we're going to sort of look at things, there's going to be some things that we can say. The way we're going to try to break it down is to look at sort of functional divisions in terms of, what part does what computation. We're going to kind of look at sensory motor divisions, so what parts are involved in sensing and controlling what body parts. And then there's going to be some mention, some people will also focus a lot on, at each part of the cortex, there's going to be different, the actual structure of the cortex is going to be slightly different, and there's different connectivity between areas. So exactly how different areas connect to different other areas is going to be relevant. All right, we'll see whether or not that's going to make any sense. Let's get something a little bit more concrete here. I'm going to start with the major cortical divisions. This sort of this map here, it's turning the cortex into 4 major divisions. The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe. Frontal lobe is in the front, yay. Doesn't, they're just names. They haven't, we'll get to actually their functionality in a moment. But that general breakdown is going to be where we're going to start from. And if we zoom in a little bit more and try to get a little bit of how this associates with sensory data, now we can start trying to track down exactly what's, or at least get some sense of what's going on here. For example, let's start with vision. Vision has the clearest example. Data from your eye it comes back routed through the thalamus, and the very first place it goes now, so the eye is here at the front, but the very first place that it goes is right at the back of the brain and the occipital cortex. And so this is going to be the primary visual area. All right, so then that's really strongly well established. And then what's going to happen, so there's going to be some area of the occipital cortex that is the primary visual area. And then we're going to build up sort of a hierarchy outside of that. So outside of that one area, we're going to start to get more complex, higher order aspects. So like the raw visual data might be represented here in V1. But then we're going to build up sort of, okay, if this is just saying, okay, there's blobs at this location on my visual field, there's another blob at this other location on my visual field, then higher order areas might start doing things like, oh, okay, there's an edge here at this location. Oh, and then even higher orders might say, okay, there's a couple different edges combining together. Okay, there's a box at this location. And then higher orders might say, oh, that's a house. Building up this sort of hierarchy. And that basic idea is going to be pretty similar in other areas as well. So for instance, the auditory cortex, which is going to be the primary auditory cortex, is going to be over here in the temporal area. And it's again going to have areas for sort of very low level auditory things, and then building up to more complex ones. How do we know this? Well, damage is going to do very different things at different parts of the brain. So for instance, damage to this primary visual area is going to start doing things like, okay, I can't tell, I don't have good vision at this particular part of my visual field. Higher order damage is going to do things like I can't recognize faces, and sort of a little bit more complicated things like that. We'll get some more details on that. And then we're also going to end up saying, so this sort of story is going to happen for sensory sorts of data. In parietal, we're going to again get sort of things like touch is going to be doing similar hierarchy up there. And then frontal is going to be a little different. So frontal, we're going to say there's sort of something like this similar hierarchy, but maybe it's not about sensory data. So the frontal areas tend to be much more associated with what are you currently paying attention to, or maintaining plans, maintaining maintaining what am I doing right now, and again we're going to have some things that we could think of as sort of a primary sort of area that way, and then spread out to these other ones. That probably doesn't make much sense right now. We'll hopefully get more details as we go into some more examples of this sort of thing. Again, there's going to be a lot of blurring, especially as you get away from these primary areas that are sort of very focused on sort of the raw sensory data coming in, and then as it's spreading out to these other areas, we're going to get more ties back and forth to other sorts of, as we're getting to more abstract vision and then tying that into more abstract concepts, we're going to start having much more complicated things going on in these different areas. Again, let's go back to trying to be a little bit, what are the things that we can actually really nail down what they're actually doing. I said vision is going back to the occipital lobes, the occipital lobe. Sort of the raw sensory and motor stuff for touch and for motor actions, that's got a really nice mapping, in that there's this nice slice through the side of the front part of the parietal cortex here that just seems to map beautifully on the sensory cortex. You sort of zap neurons in that area, and people report feeling things at different points on their body, and you get this really neat typographical organization, such that the neurons that respond to fingers are next to the neurons that respond to your hand, which is next to the neurons that respond to your forearm, which is next to the elbow, which is back to the arm. It's a pretty consistent mapping. It's a little bit weird, but face is down here, all these sorts of different parts. So that seems to be really nice and direct. Cool. All right, that's where, again, the data coming in from those sensory systems is going to come up the spinal cord, through the thalamus, and then out to these sorts of cortex areas. And the same thing is going to happen for motor action on the other side. And this is actually slightly nearer to the front of the brain. So this slice for the motor actions is slightly closer to the front of the brain. Again, it's got a very similar topographical organization. And again, if you stimulate neurons there, you get movements in these various different various different parts of one's body, so muscle contractions and things like that. So these are considered the primary sensory area and the primary motor area. Primary visual area at the back of the brain. And there's also the primary auditory area over here. So those ones, cool. We can get their behavior pretty clearly, and then things are going to get more abstract in the rest of the brain. What do we mean by more abstract? All right. So there's a bunch of different slices of the brain. Okay, what ones have we talked about so far? We've talked about the primary visual cortex right here at the back. We've talked about the primary motor cortex and the primary somatosensory cortex. Sorry, I should have said primary somatosensory instead of primary sensory, because sensory could be anything. Somatosensory is more touch. So that's those ones. Oh, and then I mentioned the primary auditory cortex. That's this one here. And then I sort of said, well, the rest of the brain starts doing sort of more higher level abstractions, and then as it sort of blurs together, we start getting connections to other sorts of computation. What did I mean by that? What's some examples of that? The idea is going to be that we can that these different areas are going to do some sort of associations between the information that's coming in from the various different primary areas. What's an example of this? So for the parietal association cortex, so we're going to call these association cortices. So we've got sort of primary cortices, and then we've also got these association cortices. So parts of the brain that are just more doing these sort of associations. Some examples of that. So the primary association cortex is going to be something about sensory guidance of motor behavior and spatial awareness. Why do we think that? Well, like for most of these things, we think it because, hey, if you damage that part of the brain, you get some sort of weird behavior. So damage the parietal association cortex can do things like ideomotor apraxia. What's that? If I tell someone to wave, they're unable to do that. But if you put them in a situation where they habitually wave, they can do it fine. Or optic ataxia. What's that? Difficulty reaching for an object that you can sort of see off to the corner of your vision. And then you just move your arm in a very different area. So if you show them an object off to their side, they can't really reach for it. But you get them to reach for something that doesn't depend on vision, or put them in a dark room and say, okay, touch your knee. They can do that fine, and they can even, these things that they can't reach for, they can still tell you where they are. They're still perfectly good at actually just telling you. They just can't sort of associate the motor behavior with that visual thing. So again, what I'm saying there is this is all sort of behaviors that involve coordinating motor behavior and something about spatial context. All right, it's parietal association cortex. What else have we got? Temporal association cortices. That's more of combining sensory stimuli with factual knowledge. Classic. So what the heck does that mean? Damage to these areas. I can do things like visual object agnosia. Here's something I can show somebody an object. They can't tell me. They have no idea what it is. They can't describe it. They can't describe the object. But I give them a pen and paper. They can draw it fine. That's weird. What else have we got? Wernicke's aphasia. There's a bunch of different difficulties in speaking, difficulties in. So there's some damage where you just have very difficult time. I think it's Broca's aphasia. So there's various different verbal aphasias that'll do things like I can't generate complicated sentences. Or I can generate totally complicated sentences totally fine. I just can't actually, have great difficulty actually having any meaning in the sentence. Sort of more concrete things, you might have damage where you can't sort of pick out fine-grained definitions of things. I show someone a picture of an ostrich or a penguin and they call it a bird, and you're like, there's something a little bit more specific that might be available, but they don't have access to the more specific concepts, but can still, so that's that's meant to be a difficulty. Yeah, this sort of associating sensory stimuli with factual knowledge. What else have we got? Frontal association areas. That's going to be planning, executive control. There's classic experiments where people who have damage to this area start having very difficult time planning for the future. Also very strong personality shifts. And then we're also going to have these limbic association areas, which seem to have difficulties with associating emotion and memory. Being extremely responsive to extreme phobias are going to come up in those sorts of areas. Being able to know one's own emotional responses, like being able to say, oh no, that's a picture of something that I'm afraid of. And to do those sorts of associations can be damaged there. Whole big giant wide variety of these sorts of things. Again, most of the time what we know about these things is because of damage to these areas causes some sort of weird effect. And it's not a weird effect, and it's not an effect where it's like, okay, I can see how damaging a sensory system would do that. It's something about, all right, we've got higher order information, and generally sort of combining higher order information from different regions seems to be sort of involved. All right, that is a lot of weird stuff. We're almost done. I do want to say tons and tons more could be said about these things. And really all we're sort of describing there is what they do, or sort of guesses about what they do, as opposed to how they do it, because that is sort of ongoing research. And it is fascinating that all of those wildly different things that I just described, they're all pretty similarly structured. Like the actual brain structure of all those cortical areas are pretty darn similar. This sort of slice through, this is sort of a sideways slice through. So the cortex is a sheet lying on top of all the subcortical areas, and this is what a slice through that sheet looks like. And so you've got the surface of the brain up here at the top, and then the inside of the brain going down to the subcortical areas. And you get these very regular layered sort of patterns, layers 1 through 6. Sometimes 5, the 2 to 3 can be sometimes merged together, but whatever. And they have very specific sort of input-output relations. So layer 1 is basically filled with dendrites and horizontal connections that are going, horizontal axons connecting to let us connect all the different cortical areas. We've got a whole bunch of just very local sort of lateral connections in layers 2 and 3. And then